arguably the most prolific neighbourhood in Canadian history, St. John's Ward, also known by the moniker The Ward. This is a story of the Canadian identity, people, and ultimately nation. A community consumed by time. As you look upon these photos, who do you see? I see the ashes of our past, forsaken now and henceforth to a nation eager to disregard its laws. I see the men and women of St. John's Ward. I see the most extravagant wedding thrown in Jamaican Canadian history at the time, immortalized within this photograph. I see John Carter, the father of the man who would go on to become the first Canadian-born Black judge. I see inhumane conditions that characterize the lives of the inhabitants of the ward. I see the men whose bond was so strong that they served as the godfathers of the other's children in a time where racial divides ran havoc. I see the baseball team of Mount Carmel Church, Toronto's fifth oldest church, a church that continues to serve its community today. St. John's Ward, an introduction. The ward was first and foremost a bustling neighbourhood home to Toronto's recent immigrants and destitute. Over the centuries, it would serve as the home of bootlegging operations, brothels, and Eaton's workers, among numerous other monikers. As Toronto progressed into the new world and transformed into a metropolitan powerhouse, one that rivaled giants such as New York and London, it was presented with a conflict that haunted many of its predecessors, the destitute. The presence of the ward would mark Toronto the Good's first brush with crippling poverty. The ward's origins. Formed as a byproduct of Macaulay Town, the ward would become home to Toronto's incoming immigrants, especially those of Irish, Italian, Chinese, Jewish, and Eastern European origin for nearly 2 centuries. Macaulay Town, named as such after its landlord, Dr. James Macaulay, who served as the first chief medical officer of Upper Canada, would transform into St. John's Ward, which would later be home to both Toronto's first ever Chinatown and Little Italy. The lives of the inhabitants of the ward would be characterized by deplorable conditions and extreme destitution, the likes of which Toronto the Good had never seen before. The ward throughout time. So at the very bottom is the capital of Upper Canada map. This is the first official map that was used. It is still found in the Toronto archives today, I believe. So you can see right beneath St. Patrick's Ward, there are 4 little plots of land, and that is actually what was Macaulay Town back then. And Macaulay Town, as we know, would transform into St. John's Ward, which is pictured here. This is a pretty old picture, but you can still see a lot of the fundamental neighborhood that would become St. John's Ward. And eventually, towards the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s, St. John's Ward would be mowed down in favor of building Nathan Phillips Square, among other monuments, such as the Sick Kids Hospital. The land that occupied St. John's the land that occupies St. John's today, St. John's Ward today, is now known as Discovery District, which is one of the most fundamental, monuments or neighborhoods in Canada today. Toronto slums. In other words, what we have read would discussed as having happened in the cities of Europe in the Middle Ages happens in Toronto now, before our very eyes. Dr. Charles J. Hastings, Chief Medical Officer of Toronto, in regards to the conditions within the ward. This is a direct quote from Hastings' medical report regarding the conditions within Toronto slums. This report would be widely published across Toronto and Canada itself and would document in detail the horrific conditions within the ward, bringing attention to what is quite possibly one of the worst living conditions that Toronto and Canada has ever seen before. For those who dared to dream, the men and women of the ward would leave a lasting impact on Toronto and Canada itself, one that would transcend time and history. Many of the inhabitants of the ward, as mentioned before, were immigrants and therefore faced a lot of oppression among numerous other factors. They were unable to retain occupations that their white counterparts were able to, and as such, they were unable to provide for themselves and had to seek other forms of employment. It was this very city, who shunned and neglected its immigrant population, that would nearly a century later be dubbed as the most diverse city on the face of the earth. History. A cultural icon, St. John's Ward would go on to shape the lives of Canadian historical figureheads, such as William L. Mckenzie, Mary Pickford, Arthur Gross, William James, and Lauren Harris, and more. For those of you who perhaps don't know, William Mckenzie was Canada's longest-serving Prime Minister. He actually served during the World Wars, and his sort of origins into politics relates back to St. John's ward itself. When he was in his early 20s, he published a paper regarding the conditions within the ward, and this paper was widely published, and it eventually led him into a life of politics, which, as we know, led him to become the Prime Minister of Canada. Mary Pickford, she was known as America's sweetheart or America's darling, but she was actually born and raised in the ward itself. So she was a Canadian actress, but she went on to become one of the most prolific actresses that Hollywood has ever seen. Arthur Gross and William James were fantastic photographers that really defined early photography in Canada and Toronto. Arthur Gross was the first official city photographer of Toronto, I believe, and William James was the first official photojournalist. And Lauren Harris, as we know today, was a member of the Group of Seven, which was a hallmark sort of Canadian painting group, and their work went on to inspire millions, and it continues to inspire millions today. So to sort of sum it up, the ward was a very, very prolific part of Canadian history and history at large. So these are all of my references and the resources that I cited or used within this presentation. I heavily used the life and loss of Toronto's first immigrant neighborhood. Sorry for stuttering with that a bit. It is an excellent book, and it documents the history of the ward, and I believe it is available at the Brampton Library, several copies of it. St. John's Ward, the community Canada neglected, the community history she'll never forget. Thank you